Oh yeah, it's
And so
happened.
it's always one-upmanship, and it shouldn't have to be that way. I'm a believer in, everybody live. You do it
There's a
the
lot of
right way.
historicity when it comes to unfortunate situations like that. But I really also like to point out the Qur'anic and Biblical point of view too, because it's interesting when you look at the Quran, right? Like there are explicit verses that are mentioned. So for example, like a lot of the critics and what we call Islamophobes, people who are kind of like scared of Islam or critics of Islam, anti-Islamists, they'll come and they'll like focus on certain verses in the Quran. So like for example, chapter 9, it has some explicit verses, right? Which are, of course, verses that, similar verses you may find in the Old Testament or whatnot. But you'll read them and someone who's not acquainted with Quranic texts, they'll go and they'll pretty much put this presupposition that, well, the Quran is saying, look, go and fight the unbelievers wherever you see them. But did they consider the purpose of revelation of those verses, the historical context, what was happening at the time? Have they read the verses before it, the verses after it, and looked at the proper context? And I think this issue is not just with the Quran, but it can also exist with the Bible, it can exist with the Vedas, and it has. So what I always like to give as an example to my Christian friends is like, for example, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 19, verse 27. There's this very interesting verse in there which says that Jesus said, bring my enemies here in front of me and slay them. Now, someone who's not acquainted with the Bible, and this is in the New Testament, not the Old Testament, someone who's not acquainted with the Bible was to open up and read that verse, they may assume that Jesus was preaching violence or extremism. But in fact, if you look at the commentaries, right, Gills or whatnot, commentaries that are available, you'll see that Jesus was just given a parable. It was just a parable. He was telling the story of some king who had stated those specific words. But it wasn't necessarily Jesus that said that. He was actually trying to relay a moral story, a moral influence out of what this king was saying in the story that derives behind it, some historical context. So ultimately, these Quranic verses have historical context. Unfortunately, there are black sheep that have taken these verses and use them, as you mentioned, like for greed and power and authority. That exists from the Muslim side, unfortunately, and exists from the has existed from the Christian side as well.
It's existed in religion for centuries.
Yeah, but ultimately, the beautiful thing is, as Muslims and Christians, we share a lot of commonalities. I think the thing that ties us most, like I said, is this idea of Jesus, and God tells us to come in terms between each other. So, prophetic brotherhood, they're fraternal brothers, Muhammad and Jesus. As I mentioned, we also believe in Moses and Adam and all the prophets of God. And I guess you guys also hold this position too, where you believe in all the prophets, right? Not necessarily just Jesus,
Yes.
but if you were to go back.
We hear from the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. So we hear about Moses and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob.
It's interesting because in the last banner there, where it says Muhammad and Jesus, what we have in our Islamic tradition is when someone, let's say, accepts Islam or enters Islam, they have to attest, if they were like a former Christian, they attest to the fact that Jesus is a servant and a prophet of God. So that's, in Islam we call that the Shahada, which is like the testimony of faith. And if someone comes from a Christian background, it's sort of incumbent, it's like obligatory for them to also state that as part of their testimony, where they say whoever attests that there is nothing, there's actually a narration of the Prophet, prophetic narration, whoever attests that there is nothing worthy of worship except God, that Muhammad is a servant and messenger, and that Jesus is a servant, prophet, and word, which he placed in Mary, that he is a spirit from heaven. And whoever